Rain hammered the pavement as Quan Jihuan collapsed against a brick wall, his knees buckling beneath him. Nobody stopped. A woman stepped over his legs without looking down. A man muttered something about drunks and kept walking. Jihuan pressed his palm against the wet stone, willing his body to hold him upright, but the cold had already sunk into his bones. 3 weeks earlier, he had been sitting across from a woman his family adored, inside a luxurious restaurant where even a single glass of wine came with an eye-watering price tag. "How much is your family worth?" she had asked, swirling her drink, her smile never reaching her eyes. He had answered the question 100 times before, in 100 different forms. Different women. Same question wrapped in different silk. Later that night, watching a crowd of admirers circle him at a gala like moths drawn to something that glittered, his best friend leaned in. "You don't need to become poor to find love," he said. Jihuan didn't look away from the crowd. "How will I know she loves me if I've never given her a reason not to?" That was the night he disappeared. He told his family he needed privacy, that he was taking a trip alone to clear his head. Instead, he cut his hair unevenly with a pair of borrowed scissors, dressed in clothes he bought from a thrift bin, and stepped into the city as no one. No name. No fortune. Just a man called Daniel, sleeping on cardboard, learning what his money had never taught him. The first days were an education in cruelty. A woman glanced at him and said, "Don't come near me," like he carried something contagious. Another tossed a few coins at his feet without breaking stride. One took his photograph, laughing with her friends as she typed a caption mocking the dirty beggar on the corner. Jihuan sat with his back against cold concrete and realized these were the same women who used to fight for a seat beside him. Nothing had changed about him, only what he owned. And now, collapsed in the rain outside a small restaurant, soaked through and shaking, he watched shoes pass by his head, unwilling to stop. Then one pair did. Grace Benson crouched beside him, a bag of groceries hanging from her wrist, rain dripping from the edge of her hood. She didn't ask if he was faking it. She didn't ask if he was dangerous. She opened her umbrella and held it over him instead of herself. "You're freezing," she said, already shrugging out of her jacket. "Why are you helping me?" Jihuan managed, his voice hoarse. "Because you're cold." She said it like it was the only answer that mattered. "What if I'm dangerous?" She studied him for a moment, rain sliding down her face. "Then I guess I made a bad decision. But I couldn't leave someone freezing in the rain." He would replay that sentence for years. Grace helped him to his feet and walked him beneath the awning of the restaurant, ordering him a bowl of soup with money she didn't appear to have much of. She watched him eat like she was making sure he actually would. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel," he said, the lie settling easily on his tongue, though something in his chest resisted it. Over the following days, Grace kept finding reasons to check on him. She brought him food when her shifts ended. She let him sleep near the back entrance of the restaurant where she worked, safe from the wind. She never asked him for anything in return, which unsettled him more than any rejection had. But Grace was sharper than he expected. She noticed his hands weren't rough enough for a man who claimed to sleep on the street. She noticed the way he stood, spine straight even in exhaustion, like someone trained in rooms with marble floors. She noticed he knew the names of restaurants no homeless man should recognize, and that his Korean carried the accent of private tutors, not survival. One evening, sitting across from him on an overturned crate, she asked, "Who are you really?" Jihuan froze. For a moment, the truth sat right behind his teeth, ready to spill out. Instead, he said, "Someone who lost everything." Grace held his gaze a beat longer than comfortable, then nodded slowly, letting it go. But something in her expression told him she didn't fully believe it. She didn't confront him again. She simply started watching him more closely, filing away every detail that didn't add up. She began asking her coworkers quiet questions. She looked up old news photographs late at night on a cracked phone screen, comparing jawlines, comparing eyes, telling herself she was imagining things even as the resemblance grew harder to dismiss. What Jihuan didn't know was that Grace had already begun putting the pieces together, quietly, carefully, determined to find out exactly who the man sleeping behind her restaurant really was. And what he was about to discover about her would make walking away from this life a lot harder than he ever imagined. If this story has you hooked already, imagine where it goes next. Stick around. Weeks passed, and Daniel became a fixture in Grace's world. He fixed the restaurant's broken back door hinge with nothing but a borrowed screwdriver and patience. He carried crates too heavy for her thin arms. When a customer shoved past her and called her worthless for spilling a tray, Ji-hwan stepped between them without thinking twice. "Touch her again and you'll regret it," he said. His voice low and unfamiliar even to himself. He had never spoken like that before. He had never needed to. Grace pulled him aside afterward, her jaw tight. "You can't do that. You could get hurt." "I don't care." "I care," she snapped and then looked away, embarrassed by how quickly the words had left her. It was the first time he saw her flustered, and something in his chest twisted pleasantly at the sight. He learned slowly why she worked 3 jobs and still came home each night looking hollowed out. Her younger brother had a scholarship on the line, one exam away from a future she was determined to protect, no matter what it cost her. She never complained. She simply worked and gave and kept going, even when her body clearly begged her to stop. Ji-hwan began helping in ways he couldn't explain without revealing himself. He found extra shifts for her at the restaurant by talking to the owner, a conversation that mysteriously resulted in a raise. He repaired the leaking roof of her family's small house using materials he claimed to have traded for. He never once offered her cash directly. He had learned, painfully, that money handed carelessly could insult a person faster than it could help them. For the first time in his life, Ji-hwan wasn't buying anyone's attention. He was earning it one small act at a time. And he was falling in love with a woman who believed he had nothing. But nothing stays buried in his world for long. One of the women who had rejected him weeks earlier, back when he was still just a stranger in ragged clothes, recognized his face from an old photograph shared online. Within hours she knew exactly who Daniel really was. She found him near the restaurant, dressed sharper than she remembered, her voice honeyed with sudden interest. "I knew there was something special about you," she said, reaching for his arm. Ji-hwan stepped back, disgusted. Nothing about him had changed. Only the number attached to his name. "That woman you've been spending time with," she continued, her tone shifting. "She's clever, I'll give her that. Poor girl playing nurse to a secret billionaire. Do you really think she doesn't know who you are by now? She's probably counting the days until you tell her, so she can cash in." The words lodged themselves somewhere Ji-hwan didn't want to admit they reached. He told himself Grace wasn't like that. He believed it, mostly. But doubt is patient and it waited. He decided that night he would finally tell her everything. No more Daniel. No more disguise. Just the truth, however she chose to receive it. But before he could say a word, Grace saw him. She was walking home when a car pulled up outside a building she recognized from the news, sleek and black. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong on streets like hers. Ji-hwan stepped out of it, dressed in a tailored coat, his hair cut clean, his posture unmistakable now that she knew what to look for. Then she heard a security guard greet him. "Good evening, Chairman Kwon." The grocery bag slipped from Grace's fingers. Every quiet act of kindness, every meal shared on a crate, every night she'd worried whether he had somewhere warm to sleep, replayed itself in her mind through a completely different lens. He hadn't needed any of it. He had let her believe he did. She didn't move as he turned and saw her standing there, frozen. Rain from an earlier storm still pooled at the edge of the sidewalk between them. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Grace turned and walked away, and Ji-hwan realized, with a cold and sudden clarity, that he had just lost the only thing money had never been able to buy him. He had one chance left to fix this, and it would cost him more than any fortune ever could. Ji-hwan found her 3 days later, sitting on the restaurant's back steps, the same steps where he had once slept. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me who you were," Grace said before he could speak, her voice steady, though her eyes weren't. "I was afraid you'd stop seeing me as Daniel," he admitted. "You were wrong." She stood, gathering herself. "I stopped seeing you as Daniel the moment I realized you lied." She walked past him and he let her go. That was the hardest part. Not chasing her. Not throwing money at the problem, sending flowers, or showing up with grand gestures designed to overwhelm rather than repair. He gave her space instead, though every instinct told him to fight for her attention the only way he knew how. He returned to the corner where they'd first met and sat there some evenings, not performing poverty, just remembering who he'd been forced to become to find her. He kept helping at the restaurant quietly, through the owner never taking credit. He never sent a single gift with his name attached. He paid off the remainder of her brother's tuition through an anonymous scholarship fund, careful that nothing could ever be traced back to him. Grace noticed the absence of noise. No public declarations. No attempts to buy forgiveness. Just silence and the occasional evidence that he was still, somehow, showing up for people who needed him. She started remembering details she tried to forget. He'd had opportunities to reveal himself long before she found out on her own, moments where dropping his fortune into the conversation would have been easy. He never did. He ate what she ate, walked where she walked, gave her his jacket during storms instead of buying her a new one. His disguise had been a lie, but nothing underneath it had been fake. 3 weeks later, Grace walked to the same street corner where a stranger named Daniel had once collapsed in the rain. Ji-hwan was waiting, dressed simply, no driver, no entourage. "If you want me," she told him days earlier when she finally agreed to see him, "don't prove that you're rich. Prove you're still the man I met." He'd agreed without hesitation. Now, standing in the same spot where it all began, he lowered himself onto one knee. "The first time I met you I was pretending to have nothing," he said, his voice rough with something he'd never let anyone see before. "Today I'm standing here with everything. But if you say no, I'll still leave with the one thing you taught me. That being loved is worth more than being rich." Grace felt her eyes sting, though she refused to let the tears fall just yet. "I didn't fall in love with a billionaire," she said quietly, stepping closer, taking his hand in hers. "I fell in love with the man who was willing to become a beggar, just to find out what love actually meant." They married the following spring in a small ceremony Grace insisted on, far from cameras and boardrooms, where her brother stood as best man and the restaurant owner cried harder than anyone in the room. Years passed the way ordinary happiness does, quietly, without anyone announcing it. Their first daughter arrived on a night Ji-hwan swore was colder than the one he'd spent shivering on that same street corner. Except this time he wasn't alone, and this time the hand gripping his belonged to Grace, steady even through the pain. They named her after the restaurant where they'd first shared a bowl of soup neither of them could afford to forget. A son followed 2 years later, loud and stubborn from his very first breath, and Ji-hwan often joked that he'd inherited his mother's refusal to back down from anything. He never fully returned to the man he'd been before the rain. He kept his company, kept his name, kept the responsibilities that came with both, but he brought his children to that same street corner every year, telling them the story of a man who had nothing and a woman who gave him everything that mattered anyway. Grace would always finish the story the same way, kneeling down to their children's height. "Being loved was never about what you have," she'd tell them. "It's about who stays." If this story moved you, don't scroll past without hitting subscribe. There's another one waiting for you next.